Welcome to the Lynden Sculpture Garden Boswell Book Company Women's Speaker Series virtual event series. It just rolls off the tongue with beauty. I'm Daniel Golden, the proprietor of Boswell. It is day 4,316 of us being in business. I am honored to be working with Polly Morris, director of Lynden Sculpture Garden, and so I pass the baton virtually to her.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm Polly Morris. I'm the director of the Lynden Sculpture Garden, though I'm not at the Sculpture Garden at this very moment. We decided, because this was Jennifer Robson's third visit, that we'd make it different for her. She'd had enough of the beautiful grounds and sculpture. She just wanted to try something new.
Yeah.
So
I decided it would be nicer to sit in my very messy study in Toronto rather than come and visit all of you in person.
But nonetheless, we think for number 4, she'll be back with us at the garden. And we're very happy to have her back today. As Daniel said, we're kind of relaunching the Women Speakers series, which has been on a little bit of a hiatus, but we have things planned. I would like to turn this over to Margie Stratton, the director of Milwaukee MKE Reads and the guiding spirit of the Women Speaker series. Margie.
Thank you, Polly. It's our third time with Jennifer Robson, and I am hoping, and I'll make a bid now for a 4th. You'll have to let us know what that's going to be for.
Yeah. Before I finished, I'll tell you about the work in progress for sure.
Good. So welcome. We're so happy to have you here. And actually, I'm glad you're not going to be trying to travel back to Toronto tomorrow, because we're actually expecting quite a bit of snow. So maybe it's good that you're virtual tonight.
Yeah. Well, and when I did travel, my books typically come out in January. The latest they've come out in the year, I think, is maybe the 3rd week of January. And quite often I have to wait to do any traveling because, I've been snowed in a few places, most memorably in New York City for 3 or 4 days. And it was really quite wonderful. I just sat in my hotel and wrote. It was amazing. And I had to try not to sound too gleeful when I was calling my husband saying, no, the airports still are not open again, and I'm
that
so
sounds
sorry.
Like a Hallmark movie.
It was quite nice.
I'm sorry, I can't get out because the roads are closed.
Yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame.
So ice skating and write your book when you're.
Yeah. So instead, no, I'm in my study here in Toronto, and I've shut away all the animals and the loud teenagers, and hopefully no one will come barging in. It's happened. So if there's any barking, I apologize now. If anyone feels their ears hurting because of the barking, that's my doggie Ellie, who anybody who follows me on Instagram will be familiar with Ellie because she's a lot of personality.
Well, and I do remember the first time we met. We drove from the hotel to Lynden in the car, and we did have a lot of shared stories about kids. So we're basically kids and pets and dealing with some of the same things, I think. So
yeah. So there's been a lot of our joke at home is it's a lot of precious family togetherness, which actually teenagers are easy, I think, compared to friends and family who have little ones, who have toddlers and preschoolers. That is a challenge. That is such a challenge, and I don't know what I would do if I had to sit with little ones and through online school every day. Right now my kids are kind of self-watering, so it's I just check to make sure that they're eating some reasonably nutritious food in the course of the day, and that sunlight is falling on them directly at some stage. And then apart from that, we're just doing our own thing.
They're self-watering, unlike your plants.
No, yes, my plants, which I was confessing earlier, the plants here are plastic because my cat eats them otherwise. So, but they look nice. They make me, I feel happy just looking at them. That's good enough, right? So, yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I wanted to make sure, obviously, to mention this stack or list of books that you have written. And well, you're an academic by background and a former editor by profession, and now a full-time writer. And of course, a history nerd, which is what I love. One of the many things I love about you, and what I'm looking forward to having you talk about tonight. But Jennifer is the author of not many novels set during and after the two world wars. Somewhere in France, After the War is Over, Moonlight Over Paris, Good Night from London, The Gown, of course, has come out more recently too. And of course, the book we're talking about tonight, which is Our Darkest Night, a novel of Italy and the Second World War. And also we're contributed to the anthology Fall of Poppies, which I have, it's behind the candle back here.
Yeah. Yeah, and which I and other visitors to Lynden have were part of that anthology as well too.
Yeah, so maybe we'll be able to get all of them to
that'd be amazing at some point. Yeah, yeah.
And I love that we share French literature as an undergraduate interest and major. Although you added modern history to it, and you were at King's University College at Western University, and then you went to Oxford. Where we found out recently you knew one of my daughter's college professors.
Yeah, Tim Snyder, who is a perennial New York Times bestselling author for, I think, On Tyranny is a book that he wrote. Quite a slim book, but packed full of wisdom. And he wrote it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it's of course back at the top of the bestseller lists for. Well, I can't imagine why.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, well, thank you for joining us from Toronto this evening, and I will let you take it away with your talk, and I will disappear for a little bit and be back for some Q&A.
Wonderful, wonderful. So what I thought I would do is just take everyone maybe on a quick visit to Italy. To talk about the inspiration that I had when I wrote Our Darkest Night, where I got the idea from and why I decided to write it. It's a bit of a departure for me. And just describe my what I was hoping to do with this book. And then hopefully that'll bring us to maybe 22 quarter two, and then we'll have time for some questions. And I'm going to do some screen sharing, which I'm a little bit inept with, but hopefully you'll be able to see the photographs as I bring them up, because I have a lot of family photographs, because I have a family connection to the story. And I also have photographs that I took on my last visit to Italy, which was a little less than a year ago, or a little more than a year ago. It was at the beginning of January last year that I made one last trip to Italy for research, to do some interviews. And those photographs, I've had some poignant moments looking at them. It feels like a lifetime away. So I'm going to go back to the moment where I was actually awaiting publication of The Gown in, I guess it would have been December 2018, early January 2019. And I had been working for some months previous on my new book, the book that would come after The Gown. And at that point, I thought it would be I thought I was going to set it in Golden Age Hollywood and take some of the secondary characters from The Gown and from the previous book, Good Night from London, and plop them down in Golden Age Hollywood. And so I did a lot of research, and I found it quite interesting. But when it came time to put the book together and have the characters start talking to me, which they do. I know it sounds a little woo-woo, but the characters do start to kind of, it's like I have one-sided conversations where they're talking to me. And they were silent and nothing was happening, and I was starting to feel a little panicky. And I was trying to figure out what to do, because at that point I really didn't have a ton of time left to write the book. I'd left myself at that stage only about a year, which for me is a fairly short amount of time. And it was at that point where my son came to me. He would have been just 14 and a half, 15 at the time, I guess in grade 10. And he had a question for me. He wanted to know, he was studying World War II in school. He wanted to know if the stories that he'd heard us tell about his great-grandparents in Italy, if they were true. And I had to be honest with him and say that I didn't know for sure. I thought they were true, but I couldn't put up my hand and swear to it. And so that set me off on first just trying to find out once and for all whether the stories were true. And secondly, as soon as I started thinking about it, I thought, this is way more interesting to me than what I've been working on for the last 7 months. And so I basically took everything I'd been working on, stuck it in the equivalent of a drawer, basically a file that's buried on my computer, and I started over with the idea that my son's question would lead me to something better. And so the stories, where did those come from? It was in 2016. It was my husband's 50th birthday, and we had treated ourselves to a trip to Italy, just the two of us. So initially, we horrified all of his family there because we didn't bring the kids, and so there was a lot of chagrin that the children weren't there. But we wanted just a week, the two of us. So we flew into Venice, and then we went to visit his parents' hometown. So my late parents-in-law came to Canada in the 1950s, but they grew up in the north of Italy, in the Veneto, in a beautiful little town called San Zenone delle Ezzelini, which is about, I'm a Canadian, so I think in kilometers. It's about 80 kilometers northwest of Venice, which I think would be maybe 45, 50 miles. And so we were visiting the family, and in Italy, you have to go. I think this is true of anybody whose family, that they visit. You can't miss anyone. You have to go and visit all the aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. Otherwise, you're going to offend or hurt somebody's feelings. So that's pretty much what we did for the trip, and I loved it. I loved talking to his relatives and hearing stories about what life was like in the olden days. So we were visiting his Zia Maria, and here I'm going to start intermittently sharing the screen. We were visiting his Zia Maria, and here she is. And that's my husband looking a little bit goofy. So Zia Maria is now well into her 80s, very stylish lady, as you can see, with her beautiful pearls. And she was so there were around the beginning of the Second World War, there were 4 children in my mother-in-law's family. There was her sister Nora, then my mother-in-law, then there was, or actually, yeah, there were 4 children. Zia Nora, then my mother-in-law Regina, then there was Zio Elio, who is the one boy in the family, and then there was Maria. And after the war, another daughter was born who is called who's still with us, who's called Zia Angerosa. And Zia Maria is just, she's sharp as a tack and so interesting and a very, very cultured lady. And so we were talking with her about her experiences growing up. And when I say we, my husband was fielding all the answers and translating everything because they were speaking in dialect, which I understand very imperfectly. I want to share another picture with you. This is Zia Maria, is the little one on the right, looking very concerned at who the strange photographer person is. The girl in the middle is my late mother-in-law, Regina, who's actually the spitting image of my niece. I always can tell who Ma is in photographs because she looks like my niece Emma. And then on the left side of the photograph is Zia Nora, who has also passed away. So, and this is a very rare photograph. They had very little money to scrape together. And the idea that at some point they saved up enough for a studio photograph, I find is very touching. The little girls in their Sunday best and the big bows in their hair. So we were talking to her about the war and what it was like growing up. I have a picture of the house that they lived in at the time. It's still owned by a cousin. The stable and drive shed there are reconstructions, but the original house, as much as it was at the time. And she was talking to Claudio about her life and how tough things were. And then, and I was just barely able to follow along. And then she said one word. She said "ebre," which in dialect as well as Italian means Jewish or Jew. And it just, I feel as if I mean, I can remember that exact moment because it surprised me so much. I didn't expect an elderly lady who'd grown up in a farming community, um, living among devout Catholics to have necessarily have memories of encountering anyone who's Jewish when she was a little girl. And then the next thing she said was, this is also in dialect, "Tonono I gasconti," which means your grandpa, your nono, he hid them. That was a revelation. And so we got a little bit more from her. Um, and she had, she was a little girl at the time. I mean, she was probably 6 or 7 years old when this was happening. Um, and so she told us what she could, and then we asked other relatives, and then her younger sister, who'd grown up on the stories, also told us some more. And we believe there are something like 3 families who ended up being sheltered by my husband's grandfather and his wife. And I'll share a picture of him in a minute. Um, and the story goes that it was the local parish priest who was organizing everything, that he'd taken it upon himself to do this. He wasn't told to do it by anyone in the church. He didn't have help from outside organizations. There were some kind of covert refugee organizations that were helping to get people out of the country or to hide them. And he wasn't part of one of those organizations like De La Sem, for example. He was doing this on his own. And so he came to my husband's grandparents, their names were Giovanni and Emma Guarda, and asked if they would take people into their home and hide them, because they were the people who would be coming were at risk of arrest and deportation. And we believe they said yes. And Zia Maria remembers at least 3 separate groups of people being at the house. If I go back to sharing the screen, I can show you in the house where they were living at the time. And I should add, this is not a big house. This is a pretty small house. And my husband's grandparents were there with then they had the 4 children. His parents were also living in the house with him, and his brother and his sister-in-law and their children were also in the house. So there were something like 12 people or so living in the house. And somehow they managed to squeeze in 3 or 4 more people at a time. And where they hid them was, if you look at the top floor of the house, there's 3 windows in a row, little square windows. The one on the left, and you can see if you just go a little farther left, there's another window on the opposite wall, just by there's a little chimney there. That's the room where they hid people. And when occasionally the police or militia, or rarely the Gestapo, came calling, not necessarily to look for Jews who are in hiding, it was more likely to look for the partisans, or to steal whatever foodstuffs or valuables they had. The people who are hiding would go out through the window that overlooked the stable roof there, and they would pin themselves to the stable roof, and hide, and hope that nobody looked up and happened to see them, until danger had passed. And inside there was a big wardrobe that was pushed across to cover that particular window, so that nobody would come into the room and think to look out the window and discover the people huddling on the roof below. Um, so that was the story. I'll just show you a few pictures of this is my husband's grandfather, Giovanni, who came and lived in Canada at the very end of his life, and was a very sweet man by all accounts. My husband has some lovely memories of him. Here's a picture of him as a young man, and that he's wearing there, his uniform is the Alpini regiment, that is kind of a famed Alpine regiment in the north of Italy. And my late father-in-law also was part of it, as part of his military service that people had to do, young men had to do, still have to do in Italy. On the right-hand side of the photograph is his wife, Emma. And then the ladies on the left, we believe, are his mother and his aunt. the funny thing is I think his mother was probably about the same age I am now, but nothing like dressing like an Italian nonna. Nonna to kind of age you a little bit. Here's another picture of them. This is the day my parents-in-law got married in 1961. So there's my mother-in-law in the beautiful dress that she made herself. She was a seamstress, and my father-in-law in the middle. In the middle of the photograph is Anja Rosa, who is a little girl, the younger sister. At the bottom is Emma. And on the right is Giovanni. The bottom picture of Emma is the only one we have where she's smiling. And just one last picture here. This was taken in front of the big church in San Zenone on the day of my parents-in-law wedding. You can see to the left of the photograph are Giovanni and Emma. And then there's the bride and groom, my parents-in-law. To the right of the photograph, or kind of the right center, are two priests. There's a young man who's really still in seminary, and above him is another priest. And those were my husband's or my father-in-law's brothers, who actually, when I got married, coming up 20 years ago, they were the priests who officiated at my wedding. So that's a big, family photograph with almost everyone there, except of course the relatives who'd already moved to Canada. We had this family story, but I didn't doubt that anyone was telling the truth. No one had any reason to lie. They had nothing to gain. And I don't actually think that they'd ever hidden the story from us. It was more a case that I had never asked the right questions. And I think that's very easy to do when you're talking to people about traumatic periods like the Second World War. If you don't catch them at exactly the right moment, and if you don't ask questions the right way, you're not going to get much of a story. People will change the subject, or they'll say they don't remember, but really it's that they don't want to remember for perfectly legitimate reasons. And so I think that's probably why, and I'll never really know why my mother-in-law never told me of what happened at her home when she was a little girl, even though she was older than Maria, she would have remembered. So, but I needed answers for my son, for myself. I wanted to know more. And so the first place I looked, really dug in, were the online archives maintained by Yad Vashem in Israel. Now, Yad Vashem is famed, obviously, for maintaining the kind of the great memorial to the Shoah. But what they're also known for, the organization, is compiling a list of people who are known as righteous among the nations, and those are Gentiles who. Without any expectation of reward, without forcing people to convert, um, they they went out of their way. They risked their own lives and safety to help save Jews during the Holocaust, and they're to be named righteous among the nations. I mean, it's not a rubber stamp kind of operation. Investigations are made. Witnesses are questioned. A lot of work goes into having someone named righteous among the nations, and indeed, people are still being named righteous among the nations. More than 70 years later. And what I discovered was that in 2010, at the request of two survivors who had survived the Holocaust, because they had been hidden in San Zenone, this little town where my parents-in-law were from, at the request of survivors from two families. An investigation had actually begun some years before. And at the end of it, the local parish priest, as well as two specific families, they were the families who'd helped the survivors. They were named righteous among the nations. And so I have a picture, beautiful picture, which is unfortunately not the clearest picture, but you can get a lovely view of his face. This is Father Odostoko, and he was the parish priest in San Zenone. during the war. This picture was taken in 1948 when he was named Monsignor, was given a kind of a bump up in rank, and was moved to another parish outside San Zenone. And he is the man who was at the center of this kind of resistance movement that was very localized in San Zenone, where he, without much involvement, again, as I said, from the church or from outside agents, took it upon himself to hide people who needed help. And the investigators at Yad Vashem concluded that at least 50 people had been saved directly because of his efforts. He asked for nothing. He did not ask for money. He certainly did not ask for the Jews that he helped. He did not ask them to convert, which was sadly and disgustingly often something that was dangled in front of people in return for help during the war. That did not happen with Father Stocco. He saved them because they deserved to be saved, and he recognized that. We believe that my husband's grandparents were among the families in San Zenone who helped. Too much time has gone by for me to be able to swear. I couldn't swear an oath to say that they did. I believe they did. I can't prove it. There's a distinction between the two. And in some ways it doesn't really matter at this stage because people are alive today because of the goodness of this man and other people in San Zenone. And that had made such an impression on me that I knew that whether or not my husband's family was involved, that there was a story here that I wanted to tell. And wasn't a story that I could tell from the point of view of, say, a work of nonfiction, of narrative history. I also didn't want to fictionalize the story of Father Stocco. There were so many questions about who he was as a man that I didn't feel that I could answer. And also, I wanted to tell the story from the point of view of one of the people who had to go into hiding, because I found and still find it very, very compelling. There were about between 44 and 45,000 Jews living in Italy at the start of the war. The historic Jewish neighborhoods in Italy's major cities, in places like Rome, Venice, Milan, Padua, Verona, they were long established. The Jewish quarter in Venice is hundreds and hundreds of years old, and in fact, the word for ghetto is Venetian in origin. So Jews were part of Italy. They belonged in Italy. They were part of the cultural makeup of the country, and were very well integrated socially in the sense that in the early 20th century, before Mussolini came to power, there was a Jewish prime minister in Italy. Um, the people were, certainly people were always, Italy's Jews were always subject to a certain degree of anti-Semitism, but by and large were able to live fairly peaceful lives in the early 20th century. And that all ended in 1938 when the fascist government in Italy began to enact some really crippling, paralyzing, and frankly disgusting anti-Semitic laws. And life became smaller and smaller and harder for Italy's Jews. And by the time of the Nazi occupation of Italy that began in the middle, more or less the fall of 1943, life was just getting so hard. And so Italy's Jews were Italian. They were Italian. They belonged in Italy. That was their citizenship. That was their culture. They deserved to be seen as Italian. But they were stripped of their citizenship. They were stripped of all of their rights. And as soon as the Nazis began to occupy Italy, that's when the arrests and roundups started. That's when the deportations began. And even though people didn't know at the time, or very few people knew, a lot of people had suspicions that the deportations were to a place that was, or places that were terrible. No one knew for sure, but it was clear that if you wanted to survive the war and you were Jewish, you had to go into hiding. You either had to leave Italy or you had to hide. And that was the terrible decision that many people had to make. And so that's why I decided to focus my book on a young woman, a Jewish Phoenician whose family has lived in Venice for hundreds and hundreds of years. And one day they are told they no longer belong. They're no longer Italian. And it's clear to my heroine that she is going to have to go into hiding. Where things become complicated is that my heroine, Antonina, she's an only child. She's in her early 20s, only child, a very close-knit small family. Her father is a physician, a very renowned physician, who's nonetheless been barred from practicing his profession. So does so covertly because the people in the Ghetto Vecchio and Ghetto Novo in Venice, they need his help. Her mother is an invalid and cannot travel. And so Nina herself is forced to make the journey alone away to go into hiding. And then to further complicate things, she's forced to pretend to be Gentile, which was really the only option. She's forced to pretend to be married to a man she does not know. And even though he's a perfect gentleman and treats her as a friend in a completely platonic fashion, nonetheless, it is a huge, startling change, as is the need for her to live on a farm and do the farm work alongside everyone else in the family. She's a city girl. She comes from a middle-class background. She's never really had to do much in the way of manual work. And it is a rude, rude awakening for Antonina. So that's how the book begins. I don't want to go too much farther into what happens because then I would be dropping plot spoilers left, right, and center. What I will say is that a lot of the book turns on issues of friendship. I'm always interested in women's friendships. There is an element of romance. But the key thing to me when I wrote this book is that Antonina would remain essentially herself. She remained true to her heritage and her beliefs. Those are unswayed. And the people that grow to love her respect her enough to respect that about her. So I just want to reassure anyone, there's no hint of her abandoning her faith or her heritage. That does not happen. There's some really dark moments in the book. It's set in World War II. The Holocaust is part of the backdrop to make it, to fill the book with rainbows and sunshine and puppies and unicorns would to do a disservice to people who lived through that time. I will say, however, it is not a downer. It is not a depressing book. I finished writing it last March. I needed to write a book that made me feel hopeful. And this book, if I've achieved what I set out to, will be a book that I hope will make you feel hopeful at the very end, and that will show you, and we've all, I think we're all looking for examples of this these days, examples of true selflessness and heroism and valor, even when it is very, very difficult to put the needs of others beyond those of yourself. There are examples in our darkest night of people doing just that. What I do want to do in the few minutes before we start in on questions is show you some pictures from my last trip to Italy. And I'm not much of a photographer, I'll be honest, but it's very hard to take a bad photograph of the part of Italy we were in. I'm going to start, first of all, with with the part of Venice. This is if you've ever been to Venice, in the district called Cannaregio, that is where the historic Jewish ghetto is still there. By some miracle, the synagogues were not destroyed during the war. You can visit them. They are very, very beautiful. I, as a point of principle, I never take photographs inside places of worship. I have no pictures of the interiors, but you can certainly see pictures of the interiors. The Spanish Scola is the Spanish synagogue that I believe that, in my mind, is the place where Antonina's family worships, and it's definitely worth looking up. It's so beautiful. This is this site. It still exists, or at least the building does, of the Casa di Riposo. That was for the Jewish community in the ghetto. And it is the site, very, very horribly and tragically, where its remaining residents in 1943 and then into 1944 were put under arrest, were deported, along with the chief rabbi of Venice, who refused to be separated from the people he cared for, and they were murdered at Birkenau. And there are stumbling stones or Stolpersteine just outside the Casa di Riposo, memorializing the inhabitants, and you'll find them all over Venice. You just have to look for them, or stumble across them, as we did a few times. In the early pages of the book, I'm not giving anything away. Antonina leaves the Casa di Riposo where her mother is living, and she walks across a bridge towards her family's home. And this photograph is taken from the bridge that she crosses. The view has not changed very much in 70 odd years. The boats are made of fiberglass. Sure, they would have been wooden ones then. And maybe there might be a few stray satellite dishes or electrical wires there, but by and large, that view has stayed the same for centuries. One thing about the Jewish ghetto in Venice, the buildings are much taller than elsewhere in Venice, and that's because there was so little room given to the city's Jews to live in that they had to build up. So you notice that the buildings are quite a bit taller. I mean, they're not skyscrapers, but they're certainly, some of them are 6 or 7 stories high, and that's very unusual for Venice. If you go along one calle or alley and down another, you'll come to a little door at the edge of a canal. And this is the door that I imagine was the front door to Nina's home. And when I first visited it, it was painted this beautiful green, and it's quite an old door that's been reinforced, wooden door that's been reinforced with metal. If you go there today, it's been removed and somebody's put up a nasty, rusty old metal door, which maybe in the aftermath of the latest round of flooding, the door was damaged, but it's very disappointing that green door is no longer there. Venice is the kind of place you don't want things to change, but occasionally they do. Then in the early, and I'm not going to give too much away, of course, in the early pages of the book, Nina, accompanied by Niccolò, this man, the stranger that she has to pretend is her husband, they walk they have a mule, but he's a bit grumpy, doesn't like to pull the wagon. So they walk most of the way from Venice, along the plains towards the foothills of the mountains. And this road we stopped along, and we'd just come out of San Zenone. And ahead in the foothills, you can see some buildings heading up the slopes, and that is where my imaginary village of Mezzocelle, that's where I situated it. And it's actually located more or less in the same place as another village that really exists called Bassano da Grappa. This is the little church in Bassano da Grappa. I think it holds maybe 60 people tops. It's quite tiny. It's I can't remember what the name of the chiesa is. In the book, I called the Chiesa di Santa Lucia, who is the patron saint of the region. Elsewhere in Borso del Grappa, across the road from one of the cousins' homes, is this ruined farmhouse, which is part of how I imagine the Gerardi farm where Nina goes to live. That's pretty typical construction, the stone and the brick. But for my descriptions of the house, I also relied on the home where my father-in-law was born in 1929. Again, the stone and brick construction, with the olive tree casting a little bit of shade outside the front door. These are landscapes. For all that I've only married into the family, I'm not, a blood relative of these people. I do feel they've sunk into me over the years, and they feel very familiar now. This is another view, actually looking down from the slopes of Monte Grappa. Kind of, there's another range of mountains curving around, but in the distance, in the far distance, that's Venice and the sea. And then this is a view of the beautiful town Bassano del Grappa, which makes an appearance in the book in a number of scenes. It's an absolutely enchanting place that was almost completely leveled during the Second World War by bombing, both on the side of the Allies and the Axis at the end of the war. It's also the site of a massacre of partisans that happened on September 26, 1944, which, and I'm not giving anything away to the plot, it is described in the book. And I was able to describe it because I used the firsthand reminiscences of one of my husband's uncles, who has since passed away, but he wrote them down in his memoirs. And so it was his memories, the memories of my husband's aunts and uncles who are still alive. Those are what informed me when I was writing the book. One thing that's happened since it's been, and so it was only published 3 weeks ago, I guess, tomorrow. One lovely thing that has happened is that I have since heard from dozens and dozens of people who are from San Zenone, or their parents or grandparents are from San Zenone, and they're writing to me from all over the world. It's one family from Australia. Some of them knew Father Stocco themselves. They all have memories of what went on during the war, or their memories that that have been shared with them. And people are embracing the book in the loveliest way. Above and beyond my wanting to commemorate what happened to Italy's Jews, which was of paramount importance to me. I also wanted to document what life was like for ordinary people during the Second World War, and particularly people of very modest backgrounds, like my husband's family, with little education, very little money, and but that did not affect their decency. And I just wanted to show what life was like for them, how little they had and how much they were willing to share. So I hope that gives you a good background into the story. And I don't know if you want to come back on, Margie, and we can field some questions. I see the chat seems to be filling up, but I'm not sure how many outright questions there are, or if it's mostly commentaries. I'll just.
That was wonderful. Your book is beautiful. I it's the kind of book where I cherish, all the words as I read. I start underlining passages.
Oh, I love underlining.
I can't resist. I always have a pen. But it was so hopeful. I mean, yes, there are some terrible things that happened, obviously, at the time and in the book, but it was so hopeful and beautiful. And I love the respect between Nico and Nina. I loved Father Bernardi's respect for her religious beliefs. I loved, just all those things that I felt like you said, we need right now to hear about all the helpers, all the good things that were happening too behind the scenes, even though it was so difficult for them
Yeah. Well, the one character where there's a parallel between the book and real life is Father Bernardi. I mean, I can't say I never met Father Stocco myself. He died when he was only 66 years old. He was still quite a young man. You know, and I really just have secondhand impressions of him. But Father Bernardi is my imagining of what a man of that decency and goodness and courage would have been like. You know, and you know, this is by far what happened in San Zenone is, you know, this is not the only example of this happening during the war. This just happens to be one example that I was able to dig into and then use for my own fictional purposes. You know, there weren't enough people who helped. That's what grabs at my heart. There weren't nearly enough, but it give me moments of comfort to think that there were some, and I just, you know, it reminds me of again how important it is for people when they see something that is truly unjust happening, that they stand up for what they believe is right. And it, you know, that's, I found it, if there were times you're writing the book, it was I wouldn't say it hard, but I I'd get myself choked up. And also as a writer, I felt a real obligation to tell the story as truthfully as I could, bearing in mind that no work of historical fiction will ever be completely accurate. It's just impossible. You know, just the nature of the work. It's without access to a time machine, none of us can truly know. But at the same time, I think we still have to try. And that being said, I wanted to do justice to the very real suffering of people in this time. I also did not want to leave readers feeling as if somebody had just dropped an anvil on them. Um, and it's a difficult balance, so that you can honor the people who did live through that time without completely traumatizing the readers who are coming to your books. And I hope I got the balance right. But ultimately, I don't want anyone to worry that they're going to finish this book. And we've all had that experience where you've been really into a book and it's so good and you're thinking, oh, this is amazing. And then the writer takes a twist. They take that hard left turn and you're thinking, what? You just killed everyone? How can... And then, you know, I've thrown a book across the room and thought, well, why did I spend the whole day, or in my case, I end up reading through the night because I get caught up in books. I can't believe I just did that. And my day is ruined. I'm not going to sleep. I'm so upset. I promise I'm not going to do that to you with this book. I don't think really any of us want that. You know, the dystopian tale of misery is not really what we're all looking for right now. So
that's true. Now, can you talk just a little bit about, there are some questions popping up, but can you talk just a little bit for me about writing about strong women characters, and take us, like, how did I mean, you studied a lot of history.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing there weren't a lot of women in the history classes you took. Maybe there were, but tell us a little bit about how that developed over time, your want and need maybe to write about these strong women in history and keep those women, like you said, strong throughout your story.
Well, and that is what it got me writing in the first place. I was, I'd had ideas for writing books that I hadn't really done much about. And it was, I was at home with my kids when they were little, and wondering what my next act in life would be. I didn't want to go back to being an editor. I didn't love it. I wasn't good enough, frankly. I work with very, very, very talented editors, and I was not anywhere close to their caliber. So it's a good thing I ended up doing something else. And I wanted to read stories about women in the First World War. And I wasn't finding those stories. Now you can now, but this is 15 years ago. There just were very vanishingly few stories with women at the center that were set during the First World War. And that's where I started. And then once I'd written this one character who was strong, and she isn't necessarily very strong at the beginning of the book. She has to find her strength, and she has to decide that she will be strong, and she has to kind of own it really, and make decisions that are hard at times. And once I'd written that first character, I thought, well, I don't think I could ever write a doormat. Why would I want to write about a doormat? I actually think most women are not doormats and never were. And that we women, we have found very, very complex and interesting and, just frankly, like admirable ways to kind of cope with the limitations that have been put in front of us over the millennia. Um, and so, I've joked about this before, but one thing you're never ever going to see in my books is a woman acting like a complete doormat and some alpha male character coming in and showing her how to live her life and fixing things because she can't do it herself. That just drives me crazy. It's just not my cup of tea at all. And and so I end up having these male characters who I think of as partners really. And I do not think it's ahistorical for men to behave in that way. There have always been decent men at every point in history. Again, they don't necessarily get recognized the same way women didn't always get recognized, but I think it's perfectly possible for a man to respect the woman that he's fallen in love with, to respect her, to be interested in what she has to say, to be interested in what she's thinking, to know how to listen to her, and I think these men are not outlandish characters at all. It's interesting. There was one point my husband was so helpful when he helped me with a lot, obviously everything to do with the Italian culture and history. His sister was wonderful as well. And then he vetted everything and went through the book multiple times to make sure I had everything right. And there's one point, I'm not giving anything away, but early on, one of the early scenes, and Niccolo is in Venice at the flat or the house where Nina and her father live, and he has stayed overnight and they've had breakfast. There's not much for breakfast. There's barely any food, and Nina is feeling anxious and upset, and so I had Nico offering to clear up and put the dishes away and do the dishes, and my husband was like, "So Jen, okay, yes, he's sensitive and he's helpful and he's wonderful, but he's a man. He's an Italian man in 1943, and I really don't think he would have picked up those dishes and put them away." So I took that part out. I thought, okay, that maybe was a little unrealistic. And but then I was saying to him, well, your dad was always so helpful. And Claudia was like, yeah, he had like 50 years to learn how to be helpful, but in 1943 he wasn't putting away the dishes. But I just think women's stories are so interesting, right? There's so many stories of so many people that just had been shunted aside for so long. And I mean, just the stories I'm telling are only just the tip of the iceberg, right? I want to I and I'm not saying I'm the person to tell them, but I really want to hear stories written by women of color. I really, really, there's just swathes, huge tracts of really important history that haven't yet been told, but are being told. Like we're finally starting to see stories come into print. I really hope, I would love to encourage people to just pick up these books, um, and maybe, how should I put it? Instead of just sticking with your regular authors that you might turn to, is again, ask someone like Daniel, like what are some stories coming in? What are some books coming in that tell kind of unexplored sides of history? Because I think I mean, I'm educating myself every day, and I have to admit how little I know. Um, based on my extremely narrow college education, which for all that I have a doctorate in history, it's a very, very narrow education. And it's funny, I have this idea that once my kids are bigger and maybe, they're out of the house and life isn't quite so busy, I want to go back to university and actually take all the courses that I didn't take as an undergraduate. I never took a course in African history, nothing in South American history, nothing in Asian history. It's just, I'm ashamed of myself well, there weren't the courses to take, in all fairness, but
you can take just a quick Jonathan Holloway, right? Chase Ferrer's on the call here. Jonathan Holloway has a Yale open course.
Yeah.
African American history. He went from Yale to being the provost at Northwestern, and now he's president of Rutgers. So
Yeah.
he has his course online that you can take, obviously, for free.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's I think, and the thing is, like,
I would rather go back to university too and be in that lecture hall taking notes, but
I'm the nerd who, actually did take actual notes in university. My kids look at me with horror at the thought of writing down notes on a piece of paper.
Right, with pen, yeah.
Yeah, it was a great way to remember stuff. So, but there are amazing stories. And I think what I'm hoping we see over the next year or two is a real blossoming in terms of the publishers. They're catching up, but the publishers, I think, are starting to become more open to the idea of voices other than just, white people. And I don't think I don't have the right to tell these stories, but I am very, very interested in amplifying the voices of people who do tell them. And I just, I every time I can't walk into a bookstore right now, unfortunately. But every time I fantasize about going into a bookstore, I just think of the stacks and stacks of books that are waiting. And just, there's some incredible books. I have a wonderful literary agent, and her clients, we have a semi-secret group on Facebook where all of her historical fiction clients we call each other agency sisters. And there are some of my agency sisters have books coming out in the next year or two that I'm not going to tell you about yet, because they aren't, they don't have covers or titles. Why frustrate people? But I will be back plugging those books. And there's some amazing stories set in the Second World War, for example, that I can't wait to read, to be honest. So
interestingly enough, Emily Erkey, I think, Emily, did we answer your question a little bit, even though we didn't even ask it? She was asking about,
I know, I'm just the worst at doing roundabout.
Well, she was asking about she was struck by the parallels between Nina's struggle and that of her parents and her neighbors and of many Americans today, and what's the role of historical fiction in the larger fight for equity, justice, and human rights.
Wow.
I know.
Well, and that
was a little deeper maybe than what we were talking about.
But you know what? It's so true. I have had a lot of moments over the last year, and I think this is also one of the reasons, just in a broader sense, why fiction set in World War II is very popular at the moment. And I think one of the reasons is that it reminds us of other occasions where we have kind of banded together with a common goal, and it's a positive goal. It's not it's not a completely negative one. The positive goal is to defeat evil. I mean, that's what the World War II boils down to at its simplest. It's not actually a simple story, but you can look at it in those terms. And but so there's that big picture, but also in the smaller picture, and when you kind of start looking at individual families and their stories, what I found immensely inspiring was just how little the family that I portray in the book, who really are a portrait of my husband's family at this time, how little they had, how hard they had to work for what they had, how unfair it was, And it does, day in, day out, it reminds me of the inequities that so many people are struggling with. And, I mean, things are comparatively rosier in Canada in some ways, but they're not perfect. They're not perfect. And the gap between people who have and people who do not is ridiculously wide. It is so, and it's shocking to me. I think it should be shocking to everyone how huge a gap there is between people who are comfortable and people who are really, we're already struggling before the pandemic. We're already living paycheck to paycheck, despite working, right? And this has just brought them to the very precipice. And I wish I I just as the historian in me always wants to have an answer, and I don't have an answer. I wish I did. All I can hope, if I look at previous times, the example is that life did get better, not for everyone, but for a lot of people. There was light at the end of the tunnel. That's what I earnestly hope, right? I mean, it's as a Canadian, we're somewhat removed from, and I'm not talking politically. I'm just talking about the what's happened with COVID-19, broadly speaking. It's really hard to see your neighbors suffering, and not feel that you can do much about it. And I if if it, I just I it's something that, and not I don't normally struggle for words, but it's something that it keeps me awake at night. And I worry, middle class people will be fine, but people who already were struggling, I just I wish there were I wish I had a better answer, to be honest. But I think it never hurts to read about times when people prevailed. And World War II is a time where ultimately, in the broadest possible way, that goodness prevails eventually.
Emily just commented, yeah, thank you. World War II can keep teaching us so much.
Yeah. And just even the little things, like I have to say, every time this past year, and I have my family, we have been fine. We have just been fine. And I cannot complain. I'm going on record and saying I have nothing to complain about, except possibly an excessive amount of time spent dealing with whiny teenagers. But that's really nothing in the grand scheme of things. But there are moments where, you're tempted, like, oh, I can't believe I have to wait for 3 days to get the groceries, and I can't go out and get them now, and I have to do the click and collect, blah, 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 because we're in lockdown again in Ontario. And really, that's the worst thing to complain about. And I think, people during the Blitz, the first months of the Blitz, 72 days, I think I'm correct there, 72 days of uninterrupted bombing. And the miraculous thing to me is that after staying up all night in bomb shelters, or just hiding under the stairs in your house, and and being frightened to death, and coming out, and your neighbor's house might have been a smoking ruin, you'd still go to work the next day. I find that extraordinary.
Good night from London, and I realized it's not here.
It's missing. Yeah, and that's an example, and you see that everywhere. That's not unique to the Brits in World War II. I mean, you see this kind of this perseverance and this courage and the guts that people had, and I'm seeing that everywhere in examples of first responders. And I said this in a talk earlier today. I really think, like, people working in grocery stores, I just feel like they should get medals or something. I'm actually getting choked up thinking about it. The mom of one of my son's friends works in a grocery store, and she's risking her life to keep people fed every day. And I think they deserve medals. I think that is bravery. That's a kind of a quiet type of courage that doesn't typically end up with being recognized, but is nonetheless extremely, extremely inspiring.
Yeah, I feel like anybody in any kind of retail right now who is who is cheerful about it, the whole
just
time. I mean, how did it do that?
Yeah, being pleasant. I just, my thing now, my husband was teasing me about it, but when I do we have our local grocery, you can do a click and collect. So you put in your order and then you go and collect at a certain time. And they always have notes for your grocery, and I think it's to do with, don't give me that kind of oranges, give me the other type of oranges. And I always just want to say thank you. Like, thank you. I'm so grateful for you for, doing this work so that my family can be safe. I feel really very grateful. So yeah, here I am getting all emotional and Canadian and
well, we have a couple more questions that have popped up.
Sure.
Of course, I had a big list. Plus, I'm taking notes. But let's see. Chase Ferrer mentioned you mentioned that you have a one-sided dialogue with your characters. Yeah. In Our Darkest Night, which character spoke to you first?
Oh, it was Antonina.
Yeah.
It was Antonina. I just, she's quite a bit young. Like, I'm 51, so I'm old enough to be her mom and then some. But I was projecting back to what it would have been like to be in my early 20s. I do have some distant memories of that. She's not that much older. She's not that much older yet than my children. And I was, trying to put myself in her shoes and to see her taken away from this not very, but relatively comfortable life. And then plop down into another one that in some ways is safer in the short term, but it's very, very demanding. And I mean, and again, I'm not comparing my experiences to Nina's at all, but just it's interesting where you can draw from things. And as in my late teens and early 20s, I traveled a lot, and I went and I stayed for long periods, and I stayed with friends of my parents in France, for example, and my French was good, but it wasn't at that point fluent. I remember being a fish out of water and struggling and not knowing how to fit in. And those are things I tried to draw upon. And even it was interesting talking with my husband and sister-in-law over the last few weeks, and they were kind of joking with me that I was a little bit like Nina when I joined the family. Like, I was this kind of outsider who didn't know how things were done in an Italian family. I was truly shocked by some of the expectations that my husband's parents had for, the amount of time that you would spend with your parents, even as a grown up. I mean, I was used to being very independent, and I hadn't lived at home since I was 17. And suddenly I'm spending time with people, and there's absolutely no question that every Sunday started with going to mass with my husband's parents. And when I say going to mass, like, you don't take a week off because you feel like it. You just went. And which was way more religious than I was used to being completely. And then there was always Sunday lunch, always. And then on top of that, there was also Saturday barbecue dinner. And I kind of was like our whole social life is with your parents. But that was something. It was eye-opening. And then along with that came the chores in the garden, right? They had an enormous vegetable garden that by city, I mean, they lived in the suburbs, but it felt like it was a quarter of a city block. It was enormous. And who was the labor for the vegetable garden? We were. So all of these things of kind of having to figure out, I tried to add those in.
It's tough being an outlaw, no matter what, but.
Yeah, and I mean, they were enormously, I have to say, they were so welcoming and so warm and lovely. And my mother-in-law, she was a complicated lady. And, anybody who grew up during the war is kind of people tend to be complicated, right? It doesn't mean they're bad. They're just, sometimes they have troubles that they hold on to themselves. But we got along really well, partly because all the things she loved to do, I also love to do. So I love to cook and sew and do gardening. And she thought those were her favorite things. So we always had something to talk about. And, she inspired my last book too. I mean, there's a lot of my mother-in-law in the gown because it's about women who are seamstresses like she was, or embroiderers, but who are needle women, who are immigrants, and who ultimately are grandmothers. And those were the kind of the principal kind of facets to her personality. So it really, if you know me well, you're going to end up, part of you is going to end up in one of my books at some point, because that's where I draw inspiration from. And but in Nina, I wouldn't have written this book if the character of Nina hadn't come and tapped me on the shoulder. She feels very real to me.
Well, and Linda asked, was Jennifer able to interview any Holocaust survivors as part of her research? Yeah, I didn't even get the chance to ask.
Yeah. And I did. But specifically, actually, the really unusual interview that I did was with somebody who he was a Gentile. He was not a Holocaust survivor. And so his name was Domenico Savallaggio. Although they have local nicknames, so his name that everyone knows him by is Menno, which is a nickname for Domenico, and Bartoldo, which it corresponds to where you're from. So it's almost like a clan, like a small, like a clan name, like, that you in Scotland, you have one last name, but you belong to like Clan McGregor, for example, something like, it's a little bit like that. So Domenico is now, and I have a picture, but it's not in that group. Domenico is now 99. I was a little concerned about how he was doing during the pandemic, because in the north of Italy, where my husband's family is from, it's it's been dire. He was out riding his bike the other day at age 99. It's just an extraordinary gentleman. So he was captured. He had been forced into military service like so many young Italian men during the war. He was from a farming family in Borso da Grappa, which is the little chiesa. That was the chiesa is right around the corner from his home. And he was actually in Croatia when he was captured by the Germans. This is after the capitulation, and they were piled into train cars. They were sent on this long journey where the men around him were dying. The thirst he described was just punishing. And then was sent to be a forced laborer for the rest of the war. And at one point, he fell afoul of his guards. He had picked up a piece of sharp metal, not a knife, but just a piece of kind of sharpened metal in the factory, with the intention of using it to better divide the single loaf of bread that he and 4 other men in the prison cell they slept in at night, so that the other men were fighting over the bread, and he thought if he could divide it exactly, that they'd stop fighting. And so he just picked it up and looked at it, and that was enough to get him sent to Buchenwald, which was the notorious prison and torture camp. And he was tortured. I won't go into details, but he was tortured day in, day out. And then they just stopped one day and sent him back. When he came, then he was delayed coming home. He needed to have an eye operation, which they actually gave him an eye operation in Germany, which kind of staggered me. And then he was late coming home. So everyone else from the village had gone home, and then he was months later returning. And he had no way of getting news to his family to tell them that he was alive. So he just had to wait until he got home. And so it was well into 1946 when he finally got home. And he arrived in the middle of the night, and he'd been told that his parents' house had burned down, so he didn't go straight to his parents' house. He went to his aunt and uncle's, kind of down the road. And when they realized it was him, there was the hullabaloo. Oh, it's Menno, he's come home. And someone went running for his parents, and they got his parents. And when his mother came kind of to his aunt and uncle's house, she went right past him. She didn't recognize him. But even worse, he did not recognize her, because she had aged so much. The grief of thinking he was dead had made her into an old woman, and she'd only been maybe in her early 40s when he'd left. And as he told me that, and it was a year ago, we were sitting in his living room. As he told me that, he wept. And it still gets me choked up, that this man who's lived, and a blameless, happy, long life, still lives independently with his wife at 99. but that was something that more than 70 years later was enough to bring him to his knees, right? That's now I will say I have spoken to Holocaust survivors before, but for this book, I what I'd hope to do is speak to somebody who was a survivor of the Italian Shoah, who was connected, even as unlikely as it was, with what happened in San Zenone. There was for many years a lady in Toronto called Esther Bem, who was one of the survivors from San Zenone. But she passed away, I think it was in 2006. So I never got to talk to her. And so that's a real regret. I mean, again, if you write historical fiction, you're always going to regret the people that you didn't get to talk to in time. Unless you're writing about something that happened 20 years ago. But, for those of us who are stretching back 70 years or more, there all these interviews, if I just thought of these ideas 20 years ago, I could have interviewed people. And so that's, that is, those are regrets that at some point you just have to, I would call my editor and have a little cry on the phone and say, oh, I couldn't talk to this person or that person. And she'd listen to me and then encourage me to just, very nicely, she'd encourage me to stop whining and keep writing.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah.
Well, one more quick one. Well, I don't know. It's at 8:15 or so. So I think we'll wrap it up soon. But I just had one thing that I love that I wanted to ask about or mention was your father, the historian.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that the father in this book taught his daughter, something that obviously became very important to her and to the story. And her, it was a skill that she had where she could, could be proud of and help other people with. So can you talk just a little bit about your father's historian and how special it was? The bond between father and daughter is so special, but he got to teach you some history too.
Yeah. Like her father, Dr. Mazin, his name is Gabriele Mazin. He's not a portrait of my dad, or even of my beloved late father-in-law. I mean, he's actually a bit of an amalgam of various father figures that I've had in my life, and the kindness and warmth and support, right? But it was important to me, again, that because early, like when I say early stages, I mean just the stages where I was sketching things out. There were variations where Nina had a twin sister who somehow got caught up with the Nazis, and then the father was this remote figure, la la la, and all of it just felt awful. I mean, I would work on a kind of sketching things out for a day or so, and then I'd be like, oh, I don't want to read about these people. They just don't seem very nice at all. And in the end, the character, the more I got to know Nina, the more it was clear to me who her father was, if that makes any sense, because he's responsible for so much of her upbringing. And the mother, I mean, I would have loved to have given her mother some more time on stage, as it were, but I needed, this is the way that the devilish minds of historical fiction writers work. I needed someone to anchor her father to Venice, and I just couldn't believe that he would leave his wife. But again, the characters, I hope people find that they're nuanced, that they're not that they're not, kind of cookie cutter from central casting. Oh, here's the, I didn't want him to be some kind of befuddled academic who didn't know what's what. I mean, he's a wise man. He's a smart man. He knows precisely what is going on, which to me just amplifies the tragedy. I did have one exchange with, at one point I was worried that there's a Nazi in the book, and I won't go into too many more details. And I did wonder if I was making the Nazi too kind of Hollywood evil Nazi-esque, and my editor again came to my rescue, and she said, Jen, the man is a Nazi.
Mhm.
Like, it just, like, maybe you can't possibly, he should be exactly as evil as you imagine he is. And so that was one character I didn't worry too much about, in the sense of, and in the end, I decided I didn't really care what his motivations were, because again, he's a Nazi. And, so that, but the rest of the, the characters who were really important to me, I did think, even down to the animals. There's Selva the dog is based on a family dog who was called Selva. In the family, I don't know if other families have, sometimes families will have animal names that recur through the generations, and Selva is one. I think there have been now 3 Selvas. I only knew the last in the line of Selvas. And dogs of, how shall I say, indistinct parentage, but very, very good dogs. So that's where my
Sorry,
Selva.
I was just looking in the book for where you did say they're as depraved and vicious a group of men as you'll ever find, was how you described the that officer.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, you just and one thing that I do find pretty gross, and you don't see it that often, but occasionally it'll pop up, is where somebody's written what amounts to like a Nazi romance, and I just think, yuck, just yuck. I'm not interested in reading anything like that at all. I really just don't feel that we need to understand the nuances of their characters. Why waste the time? I would rather read about the people who had the courage and the selflessness to stand up to them. Yeah.
And your father is the historian. If anyone wants to read, there is an interview that you do with him on your website, correct?
Yeah, it was in the back matter of my first book. We did a long kind of rambling talk, and and my dad still reads everything, and he's finally retired. He turned 80 this year, and he finally retired. Like fully retired. Like, he'd had a couple of those trial retirements, and then really just decided, no, I'm retired now. And he doesn't read fiction, but he does like reading my books, which is lovely. And and now he's very excited because both my son and daughter, somehow I did not turn them off history with all of my rambling and lectures at the dinner table, and they're both fascinated by history, and my son's planning to study it in university, which is just,
that's great.
I'm like, oh, what did I do right in this life that he wants to do history?
You're not as annoying and stupid as you thought, right?
Yeah, well, I think he still won't let me ever read any of his essays. And no, I should add, as the daughter of, as the daughter of a teacher and related to teachers everywhere, I would never, correct or mark anything. But I'm interested in reading his stuff, and he won't let me see it. He's doing well. So I guess it's soaked through somehow, all the, there's been a lot of ranting at the dinner table.
Oh yeah.
Especially over the past few years.
Great. That's great. Well, tell us a little bit about, we'll wrap up, but tell us what's next and what's
so I'm working on a book. I don't have a lot to tell because I'm kind of still in the middle of, just fighting with the book, and I had to put it down for a bit to focus on Our Darkest Night. The working title is called Coronation Year, and it's basically it's kind of a year in the life of, actually, the setting is a tiny little London hotel that's the kind of place that's been there forever, never seems to make any money. But somehow stays open and has guests who come back year after year, and the same family has run it forever, and almost as if by chance it's squeezed into between 2 larger buildings on an old street in central London called Haymarket, which has never before been on the coronation parade route, which if anybody can imagine thinking back to 1953 and when the Queen was crowned, and then both before and after the actual ceremony, the coach and then all of the the long procession. There was a parade through London, and hundreds of thousands of people came out to watch the Queen go by and wave and so on. And I had always assumed that the route stayed the same from coronation to coronation, and it doesn't. It typically it changes for, I still haven't figured out why it changes. I think it's just whoever's organizing the coronation may just change his mind and say, well, no, this year I want to send it along the street. And so the coronation route is suddenly going past the front door of this tiny modest hotel that suddenly has a front row seat at the biggest show, as it were, in the world. And it kind of changes everything. And then throw in some plot twists and some, you know, oh, I don't even want to say more. I just,
okay.
but the central character is a lovely young woman who's kind of been tied to this hotel, not entirely something that she wanted for herself, and she's trying to figure out what to do with her life, which is a pretty typical of where you meet my heroines at the beginning of books, where they're standing and trying to decide between the left fork of the road or the right fork, as it were, and which way to go. And then the coronation is just kind of the spanner in the works to complicate her life.
Yeah. Sounds great. Sign us up. Sign us up for our next.
Yeah. Well, it's
a series event with you.
I was going to say it's a story. It's a story with a royal backdrop that isn't about the royals again. So I still get complaints from people who write to me and say, I thought this was going to be about the royal family about the gown, and it wasn't. What can I say? It's pretty clear from the cover. But
well, thank you for joining us this evening. And
thank you. Well, I hope everyone stays well. And as we all get through what feels like the world's longest winter. So I hope you don't have too much snow tomorrow.
Yep. Thank you. And thanks so much. And we look forward to seeing you again. And everybody read all her books. Aren't they fun? They are wonderful. I really love this one. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Margie. Thank you. Okay. Night, everyone.
Everyone.